So thank you. Good afternoon to you, or good evening here, sitting here in Michigan. Just first of all, I want to thank Megan and all the organizers for inviting me to come and be with you today. And I want to thank you for taking time out of a very busy schedule. This is a crazy time of the semester. We're just wrapping up final exams this week at my place. You come in every Wednesday, or at least today, and hopefully some more Wednesdays here, to learn about what I really believe are some truly transformative ideas in higher education that are beginning to percolate to the surface and emerge. And this whole Teaching Experiment Academy program is just tremendously exciting. And I'm so glad that you're a part of this. And you're like an army of people who are going to transform higher education into something a better version of itself. Let's put it that way. So again, my name's Robert, and I am a professor at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. We are located this side of the state, if you know, I have the little thing with your hand, about halfway between Grand Rapids and the Lakeshore. And I'm going to talk with you today about implementing specifications grading and mastery learning in STEM teaching. So I've been teaching math and computer science for about 25 years now. This coming year will be my 25th year out of graduate school. And for the last 8 years, I have been a recovering traditional grader. I discovered specifications grading sort of by accident about 8 years ago. I just had a class where I had students who could have been doing better, but the grading system itself, the points, you know how it is, was just destroying the motivation. And I just said, enough. I started to reach this boiling point where I just decided that traditional grading practices were just not serving my students well. I was working against my own systems. And so even though I had only about 3 weeks until the start of the semester, this was around like right after Thanksgiving and winter semester classes were coming up, I took all of my plans for that semester, threw them in the trash, and started over with specifications grading kind of at the core. Linda Nilsson had just published her book on specifications grading. It has a long sort of subtitle to it, like Restoring Rigor, Saving Time, that kind of thing. And whatever Linda Nilsson writes is the truth, you know, and she's been a great friend and mentor to me ever since I was in graduate school working for her at Vanderbilt University. And so I read that book in a weekend, redesigned my class coming up in 3 weeks to be specifications grading, and it was okay. when you totally redesign a class in 3 weeks, there's going to be some bumps in the road, but it wasn't perfect, but it was interesting. It was really interesting, and it transformed the culture of my class, like from the very beginning. And students adapted, you know, they were a little wary at first, but they seemed to learn more almost immediately, be much more at ease in my class. So I stuck with it and I iterated. So what I'm going to talk with you about today is just some of where I sort of currently am with specifications grading and teaching STEM courses with it. I teach primarily, it's entirely math courses. Some of those math courses are actually for computer science majors, but it's all math. And some of these things may not fully resonate with you because it's going to be all about math, but I think they're pretty close and hopefully they're useful. So I'm a mathematician, and so I think in terms of abstractions and models. So here's the plan for what we're going to be doing here. So today we're going to, first of all, I want to talk about mainly the thrust of what I'm going to speak with you today is about a general model for mastery grading that's been slowly emerging out of 8 years of iteration of using specifications grading throughout all of my courses. Every single one of my classes for the last 8 years I've taught with specifications grading, and I've learned a lot, made a lot of mistakes. And I've built I've tried to sort of build templates for myself moving forward. And I think I've got something I've never actually spoken to anybody about this. So I want to kind of test it out on you and see what you think. So we're going to start by, I've used this term mastery grading, not mastery learning. I want to talk about what do I mean by mastery grading, first of all. Then I'm going to throw this model at you and see what you think about. This is sort of a blueprint or a roadmap that hopefully can be used to construct mastery grading, specifications grading systems, or at least for you, not do all the work for you, obviously, but to help make things a little easier to deal with. And then as a mathematician, I not only deal with abstractions, but I have to understand abstractions. And I can't do that without specific examples and instances. So I want to try to share two specific examples of how all this stuff is set up in my classes. One for my calculus class and one for my upper level abstract algebra class, both of which are just now concluding. So this is hot off the presses, the latest iteration. We may not get to the modern algebra example. There could be some avenues we want to go down, but I'm going to leave it in the presentation and you can maybe ask questions. I do want to have as much time as possible at the end for all the questions you may have here. So that's where we're going to be going today. Let's go ahead and jump into it. So this term mastery grading, what is it? You might have thought I messed up and put mastery, I meant to say mastery learning, but mastery grading is what I'm talking about. Mastery grading is a term that's sort of emerged over the last few years. And what it refers to is any system of assessing student work that has four basic characteristics that I and a lot of other folks that we work with that I know who use specifications grading and other kinds of grading systems like that have in common. One of them is student work is assessed against clearly defined and sort of contextually appropriate standards for quality. This is where the word specifications comes from in the term specifications grading. When you're going to assess student work, you begin by having sort of the end in mind. You have what constitutes acceptable product on this work, okay? It's very important too to have learning objectives defined, clear and measurable learning objectives defined for all your courses. And the student work is evaluated against those standards, okay, for whatever it means to be acceptable, okay? Now, this may not be the same level of quote unquote mastery that say a PhD student may have or an article submitted to a peer-reviewed publication may have. We may have to scale those quality standards down to be something that's on the right sort of quote unquote grade level, as it were. But still, we have standards and we evaluate work against these standards, and they're clearly written, they're measurable, and they're communicated in force to the students. Mastery grading also is a system, any system where student work is given feedback. Feedback is sort of the leverage point of all things that we would consider mastery grading. Specifications grading, as you've heard of it, certainly works this way. A student will do some work, it's judged against a standard, they turn in their version of the work, and we don't just slap a point value on it, we give feedback, lots and lots of helpful, actionable feedback that is to be used for iterating, to be used for learning and improving on that work. If there's to be a number grade at all, it's just a label, or not even a number grade. If you're going to put some sort of little symbol on the student's work to represent how good it is, okay, it's supposed to be just a label, okay, that communicates where that work is relative to the standards. Now, some people use numbers for this. They're like points. I think they can sometimes even be called points. But if we're going to put anything on student work, we're not going to pretend that it's some sort of highly sophisticated and accurate numerical data. One of the great problems with traditional grading is that we put point values on everything as if this was like some sort of scientific measurement or ratio data. It's not even numerical data. It's really just a zip code. I mean, it's like grading, trying to average zip codes is what a lot of traditional grading is like. If I average the zip code for Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then the zip code for Louisville, Kentucky, well, I get the zip code for Indianapolis. I mean, that's not how that works. So we put these point values on there, but really all we really mean is a label. So we're just going to simplify things and just make it a label. That could be numbers if you want, or it could be some sort of descriptor. Okay, but if you're going to put a grade on at all, and you don't have to, okay, you don't have to grade student work. Okay, I'm going to mention that again in a second. Whatever you put on there, it's got to be understood that it's just a label. And the purpose of it is to communicate where you are relative to the standard that is in that red box over there. And finally, mastery grading lets learners reattempt work without penalty to take that feedback, and the grade should be part of the feedback. It's not just like, that's not the whole focus, it's part of the feedback system. And the learner should get a chance to iterate on this, to reattempt work without penalty in order to turn something in that's closer to the standards. And then the cycle continues until the standard is met. Hopefully, that's the ideal. Mastery grading is any system that does these four things. The more that I've used and talked with some of my own colleagues and colleagues like you out in the real world here, the more I realize that specifications grading is one form of mastery grading, but there are others. For example, standards-based grading is a system that's very popular in the K through 12 world. It's not quite the same thing as specifications grading. I can't quite put my finger on it. It's very slippery, but it seems different, but it still would fit all these descriptions of mastery grading. Also, older grading systems like contract grading would fall under this rubric, and even something that's a little newer like ungrading. There's a whole movement now about ungrading, which is basically involves students turn in work and it gets no grade at all, just feedback. And all you do is iterate on feedback. And the first time the student gets a grade is when it goes into the report card. So ungrading, to an extent, can be described as a form of mastery grading. So rather than dwell on the differences, we invented this term to sort of be a unifier. Okay, so mastery grading is anything that's like this. Right? So put differently, as our friend Drake would say, what we're really concerned here is with points over feedback. We choose meaningful categorical data given to students rather than ambiguous numerical data. Like, for example, if I'm grading a proof from one of my modern algebra students, there's no point to giving it like a numerical value out of 16. Like, what does a 14-point proof look like? I don't know, but I do know whether it's going to be good or good enough or not good enough. So let's just give it good categorical data instead of some made up, trumped up point value that doesn't really mean anything other than categorical. Simplify it. We also prefer multiple reattempts without penalty over any sort of testing system that's just one and done. There's a huge equity issue also, by the way, that underlies this whole one and done system that we could go into for hours and hours, but unfortunately we can't do that today because we don't have hours and hours. Okay, or we could pull all these Drake memes into one Uber Drake meme that just says, instead of grading students to audit them, we're going to grade them so they can grow. Okay. The purpose of grading, whenever we ask people, why do we give grades at all? Why do we grade student work? You know, you may have done this in one of the earlier Wednesday workshops. Like, what's the purpose of grading? You know, a thoughtful answer to that would involve things like, we want students to just get better. We want them to see where they are and tell them the truth, and then give them the chance to grow a little bit. So we're going to focus on grading that helps students grow. Growth is the real end goal of all of our grading practices if we're doing it with students in mind. Nothing more and nothing less than growth is what we're after here. So I get that this can be confusing because on the one hand, we've got mastery learning, but on the other hand, I just brought up this thing called mastery grading, and that can get a little confusing. In fact, over in the mastery grading Slack community, which I administer, we've had long discussions about changing the name of mastery grading because people keep getting it mixed up with mastery learning. But I actually feel like, although they're not quite the same thing, mastery learning is an instructional strategy, mastery grading is an assessment strategy. They're not totally the same. They are so well aligned on all the things that really matter that I think that I like being this close. I kind of like the term, honestly. Both mastery learning and mastery grading are based on having clear, measurable learning objectives. Progress, although you can have mastery grading in a class that is not technically mastery learning because of the pacing of the course. Progress, however it's paced, requires you to have meaningful, clear learning objectives and meeting those objectives over time, okay? And that involves having reattempts and lots of support. Okay, so these are they're not exactly the same thing, but they are cut from the same cloth and they do pair with each other extremely well, okay? But I want you to be aware that they're not totally the same thing. Now, every talk so far in the seminar series that you've had has been about specifications grading. If you've been involved with these other talks, this may be your first time showing up for this, but if you have been in these other talks, then you know what specifications grading is all about. And I just kind of explained what mastery grading is all about for those who are new. So rather than go over more about specifications grading, I thought I'd take a little bit of a different direction here and propose a general model for mastery grading, like a blueprint or a roadmap for doing mastery grading that can work in any format in any class, whether it's mastery learning or not, whether it's STEM or not. At least maybe it will. This has only been tested with my own students, so you take this with a grain of salt, but I'm going to give this to you as a potential thought-provoking thing to think about as we're finishing up now. You're probably going to take some time off, and then you're going to think about fall classes before too long. You might want to keep this in mind, see if it's helpful. You let me know at the end of this. So let's begin with another model that you might be familiar with, and that's Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy is pretty familiar to a lot of us. It's a framework for categorizing cognitive tasks in order of complexity, starting on the bottom with the least complex task, just simple memory tasks, writing definitions of things, listing things, and so on, and progressing upward. So it's more and more complex the higher up the pyramid you go. So, Bloom's taxonomy isn't perfect. It is a taxonomy. That's all it is. It's a labeling system that is sort of ordinal in some ways. Like it connotes a certain order of operations, if you will, that the evaluation part is more complex than analyzing tasks. And those are more complex than applying tasks and so forth. And over here on the side, by the way, you can see some verbs that are typically attached to these kind of tasks. So it's a taxonomy. It's kind of limited. It does oversimplify things a little bit. Some people believe that it promotes a sort of linear progression through things, which is definitely not true. Like, you don't have to necessarily fully understand a topic in order to apply it. Sometimes in the application process, you end up understanding things better. So and it's kind of old school, and it's from the 50s. So, take it with a grain of salt, but it is useful, I think, very useful in a number of ways. It's for thinking about what learners do to show that they have learned something. This Bloom's taxonomy is a great, simple tool. Okay. Now, ideally, when we design our courses, we like to create learning environments where learners learn things across the entire spectrum of the pyramid you see here, not just the rote mechanical stuff, although this is really important. When I'm teaching calculus, I absolutely need students to be able to state what the chain rule says, for example. That's super important, but it's not the only thing. If we only live in the bottom third of Bloom's taxonomy, we may not be challenging our students enough. So we'd like students to be able to show us their work, show us their growth throughout the entire pyramid here. And so that gets us to assessment, right? It's an instructional problem, design problem to get students to engage in activities that go through the whole spectrum. It's also an assessment problem, because every time you lay down a learning objective, you're kind of making a commitment to assess it in some way, right? I mean, otherwise you don't really need that objective. It's not an objective anymore if you're not assessing it. When we ask learners to do things, we are making a commitment to assess those things, or some subset of those things at least. So we can think of Bloom's taxonomy not only as a way to design instructional activities, learning activities, but also a way of thinking about assessment. And so that gives us this model, which I am going to propose to you. I call it, very creatively, the 2D model. I need to really up my naming game here, I think. I call it the 2D model because it puts student assessment along these two orthogonal axes, an x-axis and a y-axis. The x-axis refers to basics, and that refers to assessments that target the lower half of Bloom's taxonomy. Part of mastering the content of the course means mastering the basics. Okay, and those tend to live in the lower half of Bloom's taxonomy. But it's not just the basics. We also want to see students do good work on extensions of the basics, and that's on the y-axis. That's for higher level tasks. For applications can be on that. I know I put apply in the blue oval there, but applications can be creative. And so there can be kind of in that upper echelon of tasks. So, all student assessment is resolved in some linear combination. I'm a mathematician. I'm going to borrow heavily from linear algebra here. Some linear combination of the x-axis and the y-axis, like a vector. Okay, every piece of assessment you give has got some basics component to it and some kind of extensions component to it. Some things are all basics and some things are all extensions. Some things are a little bit of each. What we really want to see are assessments that reach or span the entire quadrant you see here. Okay, I'm going in hard on the linear algebra. I hope you're okay with that. So so that's what this 2D model is about. When I'm constructing assessments for a course and I'm going to eventually use specifications grading for, I have to think of what kinds of assessments am I going to give, and how do I make sure that when I do a specifications grading or any kind of mastery grading, I'm really hitting all the areas that I need to hit. Okay. So in this 2D model, while you have individual items, these could be anything, and I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. When you have individual items that assess students' skill with the basics or the extensions, those can be graded on specifications using simple rubrics. Lyndon Nilsson prefers a two-level, just a pass-fail rubric for things with all kinds of attempts and reattempts and so forth. The individual items are graded on specs, but the course grades are based on how much area is going to be spanned or covered in this quadrant here. So, for example, a grade of C in the course is like, okay, it's minimum baseline competency in each direction, okay? A student who gets a C in a course, one of the questions about specs grading that we have to answer is like, what does a C actually mean? I mean, in my world, in my ideal world, we wouldn't have C's or B's or A's or D's or F's. So there'd be no grades whatsoever. It would just be, well, I've got a whole theory about what it should be, but we're stuck with letter grades to report things. Okay, so let's try to make it meaningful at least. So what does a C actually mean? What should it mean? Well, I think we would agree that it means like minimum baseline competency. And in order to do that, we need to see minimum baseline competency in each of the two directions, both on the basics and on the extensions. Like a student who is okay with the basics but can't apply the basics to save their lives, or has not able to, but hasn't shown any evidence of that, we're not going to give that person a C. Okay, that's not good academics here. The vice versa would be true too, although it's a little hard to imagine like a student who can do labs all day long but has not been able to show that they mastered the vocab of the course. And then we feel a little hesitant to give that student a passing grade. So for a C, we're looking for minimum baseline competency. For a B, to go up a level, it means more or less baseline competency in one area and enhanced competency in the other. Like this little picture here shows like a student that shows more evidence of mastering the basics than the C student, but about the same in the extensions. So that would be what a B might look like. A B might also be the other direction. Okay, a student could have about the same level of evidence of mastery of basic material, but show more evidence of mastery of applications. Okay, so that student should get a higher grade, but not this high. Okay, an A would mean like this student can do it all. Okay, they show all the evidence of mastering the basics, and they can show mastery of the upper level top half of Bloom's stuff too. That's what an A is, and that's what we reserve an A for. Again, I really hate talking about this in terms of letter grades because I would just flush the whole thing of letter grades if it were up to me, but it is not up to me. I don't think there are any provosts or presidents in the audience here. If you are, get on it. Okay, this is like your chance to lead here. Just get the heck rid of all this stuff and like make everybody's life easier. But, we're just mere professors, so we do what we can, work with what we got. And if we have to work with what we got, let's at least make them intentional and meaningful, okay? So that's kind of how the philosophy behind the 2D model. There's a 3D version of this too, where we take all the basics and extensions in the XY plane and add another dimension for what you might call engagement. Okay, that's a really slippery word, I know. It can refer to anything that's like overall sort of quote unquote citizenship in the course. And that could be attendance, participation, helping out on the discussion board. When you send out a survey, you fill out the survey, things that aren't necessarily related to content mastery, but involvement in the process. Okay. Pure mastery grading, pure specifications grading would say that nothing should count toward the grade other than evidence of content mastery and conceptual mastery. This engagement stuff should not be part of the grade, okay? Because the grade needs to reflect mastery of the subject. But you can disagree with that. I have been disagreeing with that for some time, and you'll see in a second. I include some forms of engagement as part of the grade. It's not much. And as you can see in the box down there, I don't think it should be too much. I don't like the idea of a student having reasonable evidence shown of mastery of content and then flunk the class because they never signed on the discussion board. That seems a little harsh. But so you can think of this as being useful. It's a modification of the 2D model. I do think it ought to be kept to a minimum, and maybe one way to keep it to a minimum is use the 2 dimensions here in the plane, basics and extensions, to determine the ABCD grade, and then use engagement, and that's how you determine whether you have a B plus or a B minus, for instance. At my university, we have to allow students the opportunity to earn plus minus grades, and I hate plus minus grades. Just A, B, C, D, please keep it simple, but you got to work with what you got. But there's no law at my university that tells me how I assign plus minus grades, right? You can make up any rules you want for assigning plus minus grades, as long as it's consistently applied and makes sense, okay? So my rule is I look at your engagement scores, and that's how you get plus minus grades. So that's the 2D model and the 3D model. And at this point, you know, like mathematicians would do, we have models, but it's kind of hard to understand a model without building a version of that model. So I'm going to transition now into some concrete examples. And I'm going to start with my calculus class, standard issue Calculus 1 class, 4 credits, taken mostly by engineers and some math majors and math education majors, et cetera. You know the drill, probably. I'm going to describe how all this works. And if I have time, I'll talk about my upper level class too, which is a little bit different. Again, not all of you teach math, I understand, but you do all teach STEM, right? Or you know someone and love someone who does. And so this may not be a direct hit on you, but I hope that can be adapted here. So let me show you how this all plays out in my calculus class. This is both an application of the 2D, actually 3D model, and sort of a refinement of it. I mean, every time I use specifications grading, I feel like I'm building towards a general theory of everything for specifications grading, but then I find something I want to change and it adapts. It's iterative, just like everything else. So first of all, in any course, calculus or otherwise, we want to start with learning objectives. Okay, so clear, measurable learning objectives are at the core of every well-designed course, especially online courses. I think we've all learned that over the last year. What you see here are my learning objectives for my calculus class. There are 16 learning targets, and you can squint and maybe see them. One of the things I love about Zoom meetings is that I don't have to worry about the font size, right? I can just make it small as possible. You can just zoom in. I have all these materials on a GitHub repo. I'm going to see if I can copy that link and drop it in the chat. You are more than welcome to poke around that as much as you want. Fork it, copy it. It's all Creative Commons license, so just have at it. And that's up to date. I mean, it's I just did a Git push yesterday on this to update it with the final exam. Okay, so there are my 16 learning targets. You can see 6 of them are labeled as core. Like these are like, if nothing else, you got to show mastery of these 6. Okay, I don't know how much calculus you remember, but it might ring a bell here. So we start with these learning objectives. I used to have 25. I worked really, really, really hard and got them to 16. I don't know if I can get it down any less, but I'll come back to that. So like we said, specifications grading, any form of mastery grading, whatever the flavor is, starts with objectives, starts with a clear learning objectives that we're going to ask students to show that they can do these things. Okay, now along the basics axis here, thinking of that 2D model, I've got 2 assessments that I use to measure basics. Okay, one of them is an online homework system called WebWork. It's pretty common among math people. Don't know how much it is around the science folks, but anyway, it's a free online open source homework set. Students get 16 problems a week. They're really basic. They're just exercises. These unfortunately are rated on points. It is impossible to change WebWork to not give points. I tried my heart out, but it just can't happen. So anyway, there's 16 problems a week, 1 point apiece. It's kind of label-y, it's kind of specifications, because they get 1 point if the answer is right and 0 points if the answer is wrong. They get unlimited retries until the deadline strikes. There's an email the instructor link right inside every homework problem. They have no limitations on the technology they use. So it's really, this sort of iterative instant feedback. It's really good mastery grading practice, I think. So WebWork, there are 12 overall sets, so 192 points of WebWork. Keep that in mind. Now, that's sort of a side issue. The main event for us in measuring the basics are what I call checkpoints. So every one of these learning targets that you just saw, all 16 of those, students can earn one of 2 ratings on them. They can be rated as proficient, and then they can be rated as mastery. Okay, so These checkpoints that I give are biweekly take home, roughly biweekly, always take home. We're teaching it fully online right now, so everything's take home exams that have one problem per learning target on them. I'll show you an example in just a second. You can go to the GitHub repo and find them too in the assessments folder. If you do one problem right on a checkpoint, then you level up from nothing to proficiency. If you do a second problem right on a later checkpoint, you level up from proficiency to mastery. Okay, so mastering, quote unquote, a learning target involves doing two separate acceptable work problems on two different checkpoints. So do it once, do it again, and I call that mastery. This is borrowed from, I mean, we all borrow from each other, so it's kind of hard to trace it back. But I've seen this done before where you need to do 3 problems, and it's like, this is two's a nice round number here. Every checkpoint is cumulative. So, for example, the first checkpoint had learning targets 1 and 2. The second checkpoint had learning targets 1 and 2 in new versions of those problems, along with learning targets 3 and 4. The third checkpoint had new versions of learning targets 1 through 4, along with learning targets 5 and 6, and on and on and on. So as the semester unfolds, students, every time they take a checkpoint, they get another chance to do an old learning target. There are no limits on technology on this. And this is a big change for me, but I just couldn't figure out a way to limit student use of technology that wasn't like creating an Orwellian police state with all these horrible Proctorio and whatever else it is, proctoring tools, which are just horrible and broken in many different ways. So I just said, you know what, use what you want. I'm going to just try to ask different questions, right? You'll see an example here in a second. But if you need to check your work with a graph, go for it. Who's to stop you, right? You're sitting there in your bedroom in your pajamas. I'm not going to be invading your space. You can use Wolfram Alpha to do anything you need to, but you got to show your work and you got to explain what you're doing. Each problem is graded on specs, either pass, fail. A pass, we have very high standards for pass. Basically, a pass means there's no mistakes. That's it. Okay, you cannot mess up on your problem unless you make you're allowed one simple arithmetic error, any sort of error that's not truly related to the learning target, like you screw up a sign error and it's not like a horrible sign error, or you copy the problem down wrong and it doesn't oversimplify it. One simple error per problem is allowed. Everything else has to be right, period. Because you have literally the entire internet there at your disposal to check your work. Okay. So it's really, really stringent, okay? And it's not easy to pass these things. So when you pass one of these problems, you level up, just like a video game. Here's an example of two of the same learning target on 2 consecutive checkpoints. So this is from checkpoint 6. This is one about finding critical values and classifying critical values as local extreme or not. And so you can see it's the same question with a different function. That's all we're doing. And it's tied to the learning target. The learning target is printed right there on the PDF that students download and use, so you know why you're doing it. Students could absolutely use Wolfram Alpha. In fact, I let them use any technology they want to do any non-calculus task that was available. So if they need to factor a polynomial, go for it. That's not calculus. Use what you need. And if you want to check your work at the end of this by throwing it up on a graphing calculator or desmos.com, go for it. That's what professionals do. We use professional grade tools to, like an exoskeleton around our brains, to check our work, to make sure that we're to look for bugs, to let the BS meter go off. And I think that's a positive development. Okay, so if you came into checkpoint 6 and you had not rated on this learning target yet because you hadn't done acceptable work, you could do it on learning target 6. And if you get it completely right, then you level up to proficiency. And then you can come back in the next checkpoint, number 7, 2 weeks later, try a different version of the same problem and level up to mastery. And then you're done with that learning target forever, okay, in its current form at least. If you felt you weren't ready to take this particular learning target on that checkpoint, you could just skip it and wait for the next round, wait for the next bus, wait for the next checkpoint. Or if you took this problem and you made a non-trivial mistake, Okay, so that's going to be like not leveling up. That's like a no pass or not, or you need to revise it. And your revision is just doing a different version of the same problem 2 weeks later. Okay, so that's stolen from George McNulty's Calculus 2 course. I don't know if that's been brought up in these mini seminars or not. George McNulty was one of the pioneers of this sort of progressive revision-based testing process at the University of South Carolina. If I had another set of hands, I would go grab that and grab a link for you. Maybe I'll give it to Megan later on. So that's the basics, web work and checkpoints. Along the y-axis, the extensions axis, we have these things called application extension problems, okay, AEPs. I made 8 of these for the semester. They're all basically like take the calculus you're doing, go find something cool to apply it to, and then apply it to it. Okay, so for example, I gave students a giant spreadsheet of COVID-19 cases from the New York Times, like all 50 states and US territories for 52 weeks worth. It was huge. I said, pick a state, pick a territory, pick a month, model it with a regression model, and then do some calculus with it to tell me how fast the COVID rates were growing. Okay, so it's virtually Chegg proof. Okay, nothing is truly Chegg proof, I know, but this is like, okay, I'm asking you to pick something and get yourself involved with the process. And we had some others. I had fun writing these things, and they involved writing and explaining yourself clearly, doing computer modeling, typing up the math to make it look professional. Okay, so these are graded using a 4-level rubric I called EMPX. This has gone through different iterations such as EMRF, EMRN, and some other 4-letter words too. I'm sure my students probably have some 4-letter words for it as well. And the grading is just done simply through this flow chart that I will not read to you because it's right there. And so anything that's in an E or an M is considered passing. Okay, anything down here needs to be revised. And so there were 8 of those, and students picked up to 6, their choice. And the only deadline was this past Sunday, April 25th. You can turn in up to 2 things per week, either 2 new submissions, 2 revisions of old ones, or 1 of each. So that kept people from procrastinating. Well, it slowed down the procrastination, I would say. And so people kind of like, you got to do the math, and if you have to get 6 of these done, you got to start working on these like right away and keep up with your revisions. No penalty on revisions. And I think students, I'm asking students on their final exam right now, like, well, how'd you like the AEPs? And they loved all this real world application stuff. It's like, to them, this was the entire class was nothing but real world applications. Like, yes. That's great. I had a direct message here that I think is worth addressing here. They ask, how many students do you have in your class and how many TAs do you have? We have 0 TAs. Okay, there are no TAs in existence at Grand Valley State University. We're a large university, but regional teaching focused. We have no graduate students in the math department. My students, we had 25 in this particular class. And that's pretty normal. I feel, and the next question is, well, what if you had 80? I feel like this could be scaled up pretty well. Okay. The thing about specifications grading, folks, is that it's really fast. Okay. I can look at an AEP and almost immediately know whether it's good enough or not good enough. Okay. It's just like, if you're a professional and you've read enough of the work, it's like almost like a first instinct. You have to kind of stick with it to make sure that you're not being biased, but it's really, really fast. And so just simply putting feedback is really the most challenging thing. I feel like I would be comfortable doing this with a class of like 50 or 60 if I had to. We don't have any classes that large, but I feel like I could. Okay, so that's the x-axis and the y-axis. Let's talk about how to put it all together. This is it. This is the grading system. You're looking at it right there. If you want to get an A in the course, you got to master 15 out of the 16 learning targets, including all 6 of the core. You have to have 6 AEPs with an M or an E on it, including 3 E's. And you got to have 170 out of 192 web work points. And you can see what the rules are for B, C, and D. C, remember, is baseline competency. So 11 out of 16 learning targets. That's pretty close to pretty close to a 60%. Okay, 4 out of a possible 8 to 10 AEPs. That's actually kind of generous. And then as you can see, if you want to go above a C, you got to go above and beyond both on the basics and on the extensions, and similarly for an A. Okay. So this is like, I felt like this is sort of radically simple once you understand that it's not, there are no points on anything. It's a little more complicated than this because I did, someone asked, are these minimum targets? Yeah, these are minimum. So like if you have to fulfill all the things in a row in order to get the grade. So if a student has 12 learning targets and 4 of these and 130 of these, that's a C. If they get a 13 and a 4 and 130, that might be a C plus. Okay, I'm willing to negotiate on that. And I don't have any rules for it other than it's my discretion. I'll look at the whole picture. I'll put a grade on it depending on how I kind of think about it. Thank you, Renee, for putting that link in there. Your last name is quite apt here for putting the link here. That syllabus for his 142 class was my inspiration for this whole thing. So you should totally read that. There's a little bit more complexity to this because I did a little bit of engagement here. So I teach, a lot of you might know the main work that I do has been in flipped learning. I mean, I wrote a book about flipped learning. I do all kinds of talks and stuff. And I was out at Cal Poly a few years ago to talk about flipped learning. So I do a flipped environment too, which means that students need to do some significant pre-class work before they come in, okay? That's what the daily prep is. You see they're pointing in the 4th or 5th column. Okay, so every one of our class meet or twice a week. Okay, it's not every class meeting, but students were responsible for teaching themselves some of the very, very basics, like just to remember stuff on Bloom's taxonomy is basically all it amounted to. I don't know if I consider that engagement or more content. It was sort of more like engagement, I felt like. I just wanted to, because you could get a pass on a daily prep assignment just by turning it in and having everything filled out. Nothing could be right necessarily. I'm going to mention something about that in a minute. And then I had these startup assignments, which were sort of like show that you can scan a PDF and put it on Blackboard. You know, there are all these sort of like basic tasks that I want to make sure students were up to speed on. You have to pass all 3 of those to have a C in the course or better. Okay, so as you can see, that's it. That's the whole grading system right there. And so to help students keep track of this, I gave them this. It's a simple checklist that they could print out and use on paper. I despise any and all LMS systems, and I'm trying to go low tech on this, to be honest with you. And so as students have this little scorecard, and as they progress through, like you master a learning target, check one off, then check another off, and check another off. And like a progress meter, as you do more stuff in the class, you see, things fill up. And I'm actually going to use this grading checklist. I'm going to fill one out for each of my students, and that's like the easiest way to figure out their final grades. I mean, once they're done with everything this week. Okay, so that grading checklist was a very handy thing. I'm a big fan of simple tools that could be analog if you wanted them to be. Okay, I'm all about digital tools, but for something like this, I feel like it's reassuring to have something, just a checklist, okay, that you can keep referring back to. Now we are definitely not going to have time to talk about the modern algebra, but I might skim through just a couple of things with that. But I had another DM here. It says, do you consider a grade if a student solves some problems from a mathematics journal? That wasn't part of my system, but it could be part of your system. That could be part of, you could say, for example, like if you found a problem from Crux or one of the MAA magazines that has little problems in it, and you can solve a problem that demonstrates that you have proficiency on one of these learning targets, then you can do it, solve it, bring it to me, we'll talk about it, and you can make a case that your work satisfies that learning target. That's the standards-based grading approach to mastery grading. Like, you don't really care what the assessment actually is. You have like some default assessments, but you'll take anything, okay? Later, the learning targets that come later in the course, I should say, like 14, 15, and 16, weren't covered until the last 2 weeks of classes. So I gave students some opportunities to give some alternative ways of leveling up on those. It's not exactly what this person is asking if you solve a problem from a math journal. Okay, but certainly you're free. I mean, remember, folks, the grading system serves you. You don't serve the grading system. Okay, it's your system, and you set it up, and you can bend those rules as much as you want, as long as you bend them the same way every time for students in the same circumstance. Okay, remember, you are lord of the grading system. The grading system is not the lord of you. Okay. Let me, I'll leave this here for you about the modern algebra class. It was really different. It's an upper level proof-based course. And so it wasn't really like I hesitated to call it standards based. It was really much more specifications based. There weren't a lot of content objectives here. There are objectives, but not targets. And I've got a GitHub for that too. Here, let me grab the link and drop it in here so you all can have it if you want it. There it is. And so I'll just say that I had basics here that were someone was asking about. Sorry about that, Barrett. I don't think we have time. I've been very happy to take questions on that, but I don't want to be here until 10 o'clock at night. So you have stuff along the basics, but not a lot, right? Because in an upper level course, there's not a lot of basics. I mean, there's a lot of it, but really the star of the show is extensions. And we have 3 of those actually. And I'll just leave this here. There's the grading system, and it's kind of looks pretty similar. So I'm going to come here to the end here just to kind of give you some perspective on how all this is coming together. So like I said, I've been using mastery grading for about 8 years now on a variety of different courses. Discrete structures for computer science is another one that I teach a lot. And I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've learned a lot, hopefully. And coming especially out of this academic year, we've all thought more carefully than ever about how we put our courses together, probably. I've been thinking a lot about how my mastery grading practice works. And here are 6 things that I think about how it's working. I just finished my winter semester classes, so some of these are pretty fresh. So number one, I think the 2D model is better than the 3D model. Honestly, I think it's okay to have engagement as part of the system, but I think it's better without, honestly. I need to find better ways to factor engagement into my model here. I want engagement, of course. We all want student engagement, but I really don't like the clutter that it creates in the system itself, right? It just complexifies things. And I really don't like using grades as incentives to get students to do things like the carrot that hangs out in front of them. I don't like that. I mean, we're trying to get away from this whole point grubbing, game playing type of thing here. So I prefer to increase the connection of my assessments, whether I feel like they're engagement now. I prefer to increase the connection of those engagement assessments with content and then call them content. So I have some things to think through for the fall. In other words, I'm just airing out my issues here. Another thing that I think is I think that it is a little dangerous to put too much emphasis on the basics, even in a course like calculus, where there's like a lot of basics here. For me, the extensions are the real test of the learning here. And they seem to get way too little attention from students. When I put checkpoints in front of my students in calculus and those AEP problems in front of my students in calculus, they focus like a laser on those checkpoints and really don't even think too much about AEPs. I had students who were turning in their very first AEP literally 3 days ago. And like, what are you doing there, man? So I feel like heuristically speaking, I kind of the linear combination, the weighting that I feel like would be like about 70%, whatever that means in specs grading should be coming from extensions, and the rest of it should be coming from basics, not 50-50 or even, yeah. So I think that extension should be more prominently featured. Okay. Another thing I think is that you need to have at least 2 points of data for each axis. Okay, like back in my calculus course, I had 2 things on the basics axis, the web work and the checkpoints, but I only had 1 thing measuring extensions. And I'm starting to think like maybe I think I need something else, something that's not an AEP that does extensions. I'm not sure what that looks like, but I feel like I'm not triangulating my data enough. Another thing that I think here is that it's better to have a small number of basics with very high standards than to have a large number of basics at all. Okay. One of the things that I did to respond to the whole pandemic and the need for simplicity is to simply cut back on the content in my course. I was the department chair at Grand Valley at the time the pandemic ramped up and hit. And I told every faculty member in the department, as long as your course vaguely resembles the syllabus of record that is on file, it's fine. So cut what you need to. I took my calculus class from 25 learning targets to 16. Part of that was through consolidating. There were some things like, I don't really need to measure this concept on such a fine grain. Some of them are just straight up deletions. So like, for example, I'm going to tell you something I have not told anybody in my department. I don't teach related rates problems anymore. I just cut it. I cut it from the class. Like who needs related rates problem? When's the last time I have ever heard somebody teaching a related rates problem? So I just cut the whole section, it generated an entire week of time that I could drill into something else. And nobody has noticed. Not just complained, not even noticed, it was gone. Like when you cut something and nobody notices, it wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. So I had a ton of learning targets. And so you forced into doing like a lot of assessments, and you know what happens next. You got to have lower standards because you just can't drive yourself crazy with the grading. With fewer targets, I can amp up the standards. And I think that that's a positive development. Okay? I think it helps students. Fifthly, I think that a 2-level rubric is way better than a 4-level rubric. Okay. I think I'm going to go back in the fall to just going with Lyndon Nilsson's original idea of having a pass-fail rubric for everything, or accept, revise, or whatever we want to call it, so it's non-threatening. I think it's just a lot easier, a lot simpler, a lot more focused. Okay. And that gets me to my last thing here, and that is just like Thoreau said, simplify, simplify, simplify. Like whatever can be done to simplify without losing information in the process is a good thing. Yeah. Satisfactory needs revision. Yeah. I had students getting confused because they thought EMPX, was supposed to mean progressing. It was supposed to mean like, it's really not good enough, but you're getting there. And a lot of students thought it meant pass. So it's like, you can't win, right? I'm going to have to start using emojis, for my grades. Or why not? They're just labels, and maybe that could be fun. Okay, so finally, you've been very, very patient in looking at all this stuff and considering all these models I've presented today. But I think there's one last thing to mention, and it's something that the great statistician George Box said, namely that all these models are wrong, but some of them are useful. Okay, so grading systems, they're models too. They're just little contraptions that we create to somehow give students an avenue for growth. Okay, all of them are flawed in some way. Some of them are flawed in huge ways, and we're just now beginning to realize that, and you are too. So what we're trying to do here is come up with something useful for everyone that gives all the students, all of our students, no matter who they are, where they come from, what their backgrounds are, what they're studying, give them the best shot they can to grow as learners over their whole lifetimes. So that's it for me. I want to thank you again. Here's some stuff for me. I have a little link there if you think about it. If you have a moment, you click that link, and I just always like to get feedback from the people I speak with to see what could have been better. It's because I do spec spreading on myself too. So there's the link.
I have kind of a technical question, actually. You have these learning targets that people have to reach with mastery and different levels for the different grade levels. Do you have any trouble worrying about if each of those 16 different possible things are about the same weight or value? And then also, does it matter?
I think the second question is more important than the first one, but yeah, I do. I want to make sure that that's where some of the consolidation, Dennis, I mentioned kind of came from. I look back at my older, like really large course. I have to say that I got an email last night from one of my GVSU colleagues asking a question because they were just like super strung out on grading. And I said, well, tell me about your system. I said, well, I have 50 learning targets. So there's your problem right there. There's no way to do that. And it's you look back and like, not all of these can possibly really be sort of equivalent in importance, right? So it's a challenge, right? And I've been teaching calculus for 30 years, and so that's why I can look at these things and sort of gauge, like, all right, so being able to set up and do an applied optimization problem is roughly, I believe, equivalent to being able to take a basic derivative in terms of importance to the course, right? So yeah, it's not easy. It's a difficult exercise, and any one of us who are math people could come up with different lists, and that's okay, because you're the designer of the course, and so you're just going to do that. I think that if you ended up with like a couple of learning objectives that one was a little on the lightweight side, possibly, I think that would be okay. I mean, they would stop being okay when you have more targets than you can possibly assess and stay sane. I think what you what you definitely want to avoid is having so many targets, so many objectives in your course that you've written checks that your brain, your professional will cannot cash, right? I mean, every time you lay down an objective, you're making a commitment to assess it. So choose wisely, glue them together if you need to. Just don't create too many, I would say. But if you end up like you feel like you've got a manageable list and one of them seems a little bit little bit fluffy, and I think that's probably okay.
Yeah.
Fluffy, that's a real word. Term.
Is
Bear,
there
I see your hand up, your physical hand up here. And I know you were dropping some stuff in the chat, so please go ahead. I feel like you've been waiting for a while.
No, it's okay. I'm thinking about taking the plunge into a mastery grading system in a combinatorics class this summer.
Good choice.
But my first draft has, let's just say, a lot of learning outcomes. So you've encouraged me to rethink that. But some of the outcomes that I have, it's a really small number, are almost more habits of mind or like problem solving skills that I want to see them demonstrating over and over. So, for example, I have one, which is that, I can write a simpler version of a problem to sort of test my answer to a more complicated version. Like if the complicated question has, 500 people in it, I can make one with 4 and then kind of just enumerate and count. Have you done any of those sort of like metacognition kind of objectives before?
Not me. First of all, I'm going to drop yet another GitHub repo. That's for my discrete structures course. And the first semester of that is basically a combinatorics class. So that might be useful, maybe not. Maybe it's useful in like what not to do. I don't know. I have colleagues in my department who do stuff like that. And they say, yeah, I want to have some, I think they're actually called habits of mind objectives, right? And I think if you want to do that, then that's absolutely fine. You might want to make sure that it's not redundant with anything else that's in your class. Like the thing you want to do is make this very efficient. So you're not assessing the same thing twice unless you really mean to assess it twice, right? This is one of the things that specs grading does for us is it says, when I sit down to write an exam, if that's what you're into, I don't want to have like 100 problems on the chain rule when I only need 3. Okay. So, for me personally, I don't, because I feel like that sort of thing is taken care of by the extension stuff. Like that's on the y-axis. Okay. I don't want to think that that's on the x-axis, right? So that's not a lower half of Bloom's taxonomy. That's an upper half of Bloom's taxonomy. And so rather than test it with a discrete objective, I think I would probably create like some application extension problems where that's sort of like, that's part of the solution. That's part of what acceptable means. You got to show me concrete evidence of writing things in a simpler problem. And you don't get a passing grade on this unless you do. So it's not an objective. It's like, it's part of the spec, I guess. So someone was asking, it might have been you, was asking, what's the difference between a learning objective and a learning target? For me, not really much, but that's one thing, like that could be like a course level objective for your class that is not measured by a small, fine-grained learning target. And it might be more efficient that way. And it kind of comes out in the wash by saying like, well, you got to have, if you want an A in the class, you got to do 6 out of 8 of these application extension problems that all have these characteristics of your solution 6 times. Okay, so that's pretty rigorous. And so by the end of the day, an A student has mastered that habit of mind because they've done it 6 times. Maybe that's not enough to be like real mastery. I mean, but it's appropriately scaled for the age group. And that's my philosophy about it. Other people can disagree, and I know other people that I respect very greatly don't do it that way. So,
thanks.
Yeah. I'm looking, I know there's like several of you here. I'm looking for, I got the participant list up. And so if you have a question, just sort of Zoom raise your hand. Do we all know how to do that? I forget sometimes because I'm always on the giving end of these things. But it's down there under reactions, I think. Yeah, raising them. Okay, Hillary, I see you there. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. How do you keep track of who's leveled up to where? Do the students do it, or do you do it, or does your LMS do it?
We use Blackboard as our LMS. So, pray for me, first of all. Second of all, there's a thing in Blackboard called a schema. Okay. And basically a schema is a way of mapping a number onto a text label. It's perfect for what we do here. Okay, so it's a schema. I wrote a little how-to document for my department on this, but I don't have it on hand. If you could shoot me your email, I'll get it out to you. But there's a way that I can go in and say, like, a schema is where if I enter in a 1, it's going to say pass, and if I enter in a 0, it's going to say no pass. And so, I mean, I put it on the paper or the PDF or whatever, and I just go through and I'll just put 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1 in the student's grades, and it shows up. And so that's for the learning targets that have 3 levels, like no rating, proficiency, mastery. I just say I want a 2 to map to mastery. I want 1 to map to proficiency, and I want 0 to map to no rating. And so it's just entering 0, 1, 2. You can only enter in numbers into the LMS, but you can make them appear as whatever text label you wish.
And then the students know on the next biweekly assessment, they don't have to do learnings 1 through 4 because they've got M's on them all, or mastery.
Right. Once they hit mastery, yeah, we make that. Try to make that as clear as possible. Once you've hit mastery on things, please do not reattempt. Okay? Right. Because they end up grading. It's like, oh man, you had mastery on this before. What are you doing? It really annoys me. So you don't want that. It's like, I'm telling you when not to work, right? You should be happy about this.
Makes sense.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, Canvas, Jennifer points out, Canvas does a much better job with this than Blackboard does. You know, bar is pretty low for Blackboard, honestly. But I mean, Canvas, I think, actually has some built-in functionality for mastery grading. It's not much. It's a little weak. And I've never actually used it because we're not on a Canvas campus. But that's someone posted up a link in the chat earlier to a mastery grading Slack workspace. And that would be, if you have time, I know yet another thing to check, right? But we have 750 people on the Slack network from all across the spectrum, not just STEM people, humanities, arts, vocational education, high school. And there's a whole section, whole channel on the Slack network for working with LMSs. Basically, it's grade tracking is the name of the channel. And so that's where the really technical stuff gets into play here.